The champagne flute slipped from my fingers as my cousin's words cut through the air. "I hope," Madison said with a practiced half-laugh that carried across the elegant restaurant, "I never end up like some people, single, pushing 30, and raising a kid alone." Glass shattered against hardwood. Champagne splashed my borrowed shoes. But it wasn't the broken glass that made everyone turn, it was the sudden, deafening silence that followed her words. Time seemed to slow. I could hear my own heartbeat drumming against my ribs as laughter erupted around the table. Real laughter. Comfortable. Cruel. My uncle slapped the table and added, "You know what they say, men don't want used goods. That's just how it is." Even my mother gave a soft chuckle, covering her mouth as though that somehow made it less painful. Across the room, my 6-year-old son Oliver looked up from his coloring, his eyes finding mine through the forest of wine glasses and centerpieces. I forced my face to remain neutral, but beneath the table, my hands had curled into fists so tight my nails carved half-moons into my palms. "My name is Nora, I'm 32, and I work 2 jobs to support my son. This is the story of how I finally stopped shrinking to make room for other people's cruelty. For years, I'd been the family's cautionary tale. The one who got pregnant at 23 and raised a child alone while Madison traveled Europe, dated successful men, and became the golden child. At every holiday, every gathering, the contrast was carefully maintained. Madison achieved. I disappointed. Madison succeeded. I survived. I'd arrived at her engagement dinner tonight after 3 shifts back-to-back, my nicest dress slightly wrinkled, in heels borrowed from my neighbor. The seating arrangement wasn't accidental, I was placed at the far end of the table, beside elderly relatives who spent more time showing me photos of their pets than asking about my life. I was a prop in their performance, the necessary shadow that made Madison's light seem brighter. Now, as laughter rippled through the room at my expense, I watched Madison bask in the attention. Her fiancé Peter sat beside her, his expression unreadable. He glanced at me, then down at his plate, then back at Madison with something I couldn't quite identify in his eyes. My Aunt Vivian leaned in and whispered, "Oh honey, don't take it personally. Madison just likes to be the center of attention." But it wasn't about attention. It was about power. About reminding everyone that I didn't belong. I thought about grabbing Oliver and leaving. About creating a scene that would confirm everything they already believed about me. But something kept me rooted to that chair. Not shame. Not fear. Something deeper, something that felt like the last ember of a fire refusing to die. Madison, satisfied with the laughter, moved on. She made another joke about how Peter had to give up video games and wouldn't survive marriage without her telling him what to wear. The laughter was thinner this time. Some people shifted in their chairs, but still, no one interrupted. I looked at my son again. Oliver. The reason I worked overtime and took night classes and kept going when everything felt impossible. He was coloring intently, oblivious to the undercurrents in the room. I wondered what he would remember from tonight. What lessons he was absorbing about his worth, about mine. The chatter continued around me. Wedding plans. Honeymoon destinations. Career achievements. I nodded at appropriate moments, passed dishes when asked, and tried to become invisible. It was a skill I'd perfected, existing without disturbing the carefully constructed narrative of our family. Bailey never had much ambition, I overheard my uncle telling someone at the other end of the table. Such a shame. She was so bright before. He trailed off, but the implication hung in the air. Before Oliver. Before I ruined everything. The dinner plates were being cleared when it happened. Peter stood up, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that cut through conversation. Every eye turned to him. Madison's smile faltered. "I think they should know something," he said, voice steady. Madison blinked rapidly, confusion crossing her perfect features. My Uncle Robert lowered his glass. My mother finally looked at me instead of through me. Peter walked the full length of the table and stopped beside me. The silence thickened, pressing against my skin like a physical weight. "Maddie," he said, addressing her by a nickname I'd never heard before, "that wasn't just a joke. That was cruel." She tried to interject, but he raised a hand. "No, I need to say this." He looked around, locking eyes with people who moments ago had laughed. "You all treat Nora like she's some kind of failure, like her life is something to mock. But what you don't know is that she's the strongest person in this room." My breath caught. The room tilted slightly. 2 years ago, Peter continued, I was laid off from my job. I spiraled, fell into depression, started drinking more than I should have. Madison told me to snap out of it. Robert said to stop being weak. He turned to me. But Nora checked in on me every week. No one moved. She didn't just say kind words. She gave her time. She helped rewrite my resume. Connected me with someone she knew. She even watched my niece so I could go to job interviews. He looked directly at me now. You didn't know me well, but you showed up when no one else did. You helped me out of something dark. You didn't want credit. You didn't expect praise. You just helped. The words hung in the air like suspended glass, beautiful and dangerous. Every face turned toward me, seeing me, really seeing me, perhaps for the first time. Madison stood up, her voice rising. What are you doing? Being honest, Peter said. I've smiled through enough shallow compliments and fake toasts tonight. But I'm not going to sit here and let you tear down someone good just to make yourself feel bigger. Her eyes narrowed. Are you trying to embarrass me? No, he said simply. You did that on your own. A few people looked away. One cousin stared into her wine glass like it held answers. My Uncle Robert's face flushed red. My mother sat stiff, her hands folded tight in her lap. Then Madison asked the question everyone was silently thinking. Do you have feelings for her? Peter looked at her like he didn't recognize the woman standing before him. I have respect for her. Deep respect. And if you spent less time performing perfection and more time truly listening, maybe you'd understand why that matters. His words seemed to expand in the silence, filling every corner of the room. They weren't just about me anymore. They were about values, about what we choose to protect and what we choose to laugh at, about the kind of people we celebrate and the kind we overlook. I glanced around the table. The judgment that had once been so loud now hung in the air like fog, broken only by Peter's quiet defiance. For the first time in my adult life, someone was standing up for me. Not later in a text. Not behind closed doors. Right there, in front of everyone. He had turned the spotlight away from my shame and cast it on their cruelty. And I wasn't the punchline anymore. After Peter's words, the entire room seemed frozen in place. Madison remained standing, arms crossed, face tight with rage. She searched for support, for someone to save her from the humiliation, but no one moved. My Uncle Robert finally muttered, "He's just emotional. Don't take it so seriously." But Peter didn't even look at him. "You want to talk about emotion?" he asked. "Let's talk about what it takes to raise a child alone. To work 2 jobs. To give your time to someone else without ever asking for anything in return. That's not weakness. That's strength." Madison's voice was razor sharp. "You're making this about her." "No," he said quietly. "You already did. I'm just not letting you get away with it." Then he turned to me again. "You didn't deserve that," he said softly. "Any of it." My throat tightened. I wanted to say something, thank you maybe, but nothing came out. So I nodded. That was all I could manage. And it was enough. My mother looked at me then. Really looked. For the first time, there was something in her eyes that resembled regret. Maybe she finally saw what her silence had cost. I didn't expect an apology. Not from her, not from Madison, not from anyone. But I felt something shift, like the first breath after being held underwater too long. Peter didn't touch me. Didn't try to rescue me. He just stood there, close enough to say without words, "You are not alone." And in that stillness, in that tension that had finally cracked, I saw something deeper than revenge. I saw recognition. They hadn't broken me. They'd simply revealed themselves. And for once, I didn't shrink. I didn't retreat. I stood up, not in anger, not in shame, just steady. Whole. I looked around the table at faces that had laughed at me, pitied me, ignored me. I saw Madison sitting rigid, her cheeks flushed with fury. Robert reached for his wine, pretending none of it mattered. My mother stared at her plate, fingers trembling. But I wasn't there for them anymore. I turned to Oliver. He looked up from his napkin spaceship with a smile as wide as the sky. "Ready to go home, sweetheart?" I asked. He nodded and slipped his hand into mine without hesitation. We didn't say goodbye. We didn't need to. As we walked past Peter, he gave me a small nod. Not dramatic, not showy, just a quiet acknowledgement. You were seen. You mattered. I held Oliver's drawing in one hand, his fingers in the other. And I walked out of that room with my head held high. Not because I'd finally been defended, but because I had always been enough. They just hadn't seen it. But I did. And that was all I needed. We often talk about strength like it looks a certain way, loud, sharp, undeniable. But sometimes strength is quiet. It's choosing to show up when you know you'll be judged. It's holding your ground when no one else is standing with you. It's raising a child with love when the world keeps trying to shame you for doing it alone. I didn't fight back with insults. I didn't storm out to prove a point. I stayed. I stood. And in doing so, I revealed more than just the cruelty of that room. I revealed the kind of courage that doesn't need to be loud to be heard. Madison thought the night was hers. That she could humiliate someone to draw the spotlight closer. But what she didn't realize is that real power doesn't come from controlling the room. It comes from telling the truth without apology. And Peter, by standing up in that moment, reminded everyone that silence can be complicity, but one voice, one honest voice, can change everything. If you've ever been the outsider, the quiet one, the one they called less than for not fitting their mold, remember this: you don't owe anyone your silence. You don't owe anyone your shame. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply not shrink. As I stepped out into the night with my son's hand in mine, the air didn't feel colder. It felt lighter, like something had finally lifted. No applause, no grand finale, just truth and the quiet power of being seen. I didn't leave in defeat. I left in full. And maybe, just maybe, someone in that room will think twice the next time they mistake silence for weakness. Because sometimes the most unforgettable revenge is living your truth without fear. As I found out a week later, Madison and Peter's engagement ended that night. She had stormed out of the restaurant shortly after I left, leaving Peter to pay the bill and apologize to the guests. I only learned this because my mother called, the first time she'd reached out in months, to tell me that she'd been wrong. So wrong. For years, Madison had hidden her cruelty behind closed doors, and my family had chosen to look away rather than acknowledge it. It turned out Peter had met me once before at a family Christmas party, when Madison first introduced him to everyone. She'd barely acknowledged me then, but he remembered how I'd spent the evening helping his niece with a holiday craft while the adults drank and talked around us. When he later found himself struggling, he'd reached out to the one person he'd seen show genuine kindness. Madison never knew we'd stayed in touch, those coffee meetings where I'd helped him rebuild his resume and connected him with an old colleague from my night classes. I never mentioned it to anyone in the family, why would I? It wasn't about getting credit. It was just about being human.